Someone get us coffee? Scott barked across the boardroom without looking up from his overpriced tablet. He meant me. Of course he did. I was sitting at the corner table like some forgotten piece of office furniture, the quiet old-timer with reading glasses and an unassuming polo shirt. He didn't know my name, didn't care. He just assumed the older guy not speaking must be there to fetch caffeine and nod politely while alpha consultants swung their PowerPoint decks around like weapons. I didn't flinch. Didn't even blink. Just sat there. Arms crossed, pen unmoving. Let the fool keep guessing. My name's Brian Wallace, and I'm 48 years old. That's been my job for the past 4 years. Watching, listening, smiling when appropriate, taking mental notes with the precision of an accountant during audit season. They think I'm harmless. They think I'm done, some retired old guard, a relic from the founding days, graciously allowed to linger like a janitor who knows the Wi-Fi password. That's how Bradley likes it. That's how he designed it. Take a step back, Brian, he'd said after my health scare. Let the new blood handle the day-to-day while you rest. Right, rest. I built this company with a laptop, a divorce lawyer on speed dial, and 2 maxed-out credit cards. But sure, I'll sit quietly and rest while the circus performers juggle flaming investor money. You want to know what's funny? I actually had a heart attack. Not a big one, but enough to make me think. I was 44. Working 80-hour weeks, living on gas station coffee and whatever the vending machine had that wasn't expired. The doctor said stress was killing me. Bradley, my protege, my hand-picked successor, came to visit me in the hospital with flowers and a concerned expression. Take it easy, Brian, he'd said, squeezing my shoulder like we were old war buddies. The company needs you healthy. I'll handle operations while you recover. I believed him, trusted him. Hell, I'd trained him myself, taught him everything from reading financial statements to managing difficult clients. He was smart, ambitious, but still humble back then. Still asked my opinion on major decisions, still called me for advice at midnight when a deal was falling apart. That was 4 years ago. Different world now. Scott strutted in 6 weeks ago like a rooster let loose in a mirror factory. Chest puffed, teeth too white, belt buckle shiny enough to deflect criticism. Another consultant with a buzzword addiction and a 6-figure retainer. Bradley introduced him like he was the second coming of Steve Jobs. He's going to help us scale, Bradley beamed, using that startup language that makes my teeth hurt. He's cleaned up 24 companies before us. Cleaned up? Right. I did what I always do. I checked. Took me exactly 47 minutes on Google, LinkedIn, and a few industry databases I still had access to. One of the companies Scott cleaned up went bankrupt 8 months after he left. 2 were sued for fraudulent reporting. 1 somehow turned into a crypto MLM scam with a podcast. But sure, let's hand him the steering wheel of the company I built from scratch. The thing is, I've been in tech for over 20 years. I've seen consultants like Scott before. They show up with their McKinsey backgrounds and Harvard MBAs, all polish and no substance. They speak in acronyms, throw around terms like disruptive innovation and paradigm shifts, and somehow convince CEOs that their entire leadership team needs replacement. They're corporate locusts. They descend on a company, strip it for parts, rebrand the carcass, and move on to the next victim. The fact that Bradley couldn't see this told me everything I needed to know about how much he'd changed. But I didn't say anything, didn't raise objections or voice concerns. I just sat in my corner, watched, and took notes. Because here's what guys like Scott and Bradley don't understand about guys like me. We're patient. We've had to be. We didn't get where we are by throwing tantrums or making demands. We got here by outworking, outthinking, and outlasting everyone else. They think patience is weakness. They mistake silence for surrender. They assume that because I don't interrupt their meetings or challenge their slides, I must be irrelevant. A legacy cost to be managed until I can be gracefully phased out. They think I'm not watching, but I see it all. Scott's proposal to streamline the legacy footprint didn't go through the board. Bradley authorized a reallocation of stock options without a vote. A hiring freeze was implemented, and I only found out when Jennifer from HR mentioned it in passing. Not through official channels, not through a company-wide memo, through gossip. I guess that's how executive decisions get made now, via emoji and back-channel Slack messages. The new hires Scott brought in were all the same type. Young, ambitious, with zero institutional knowledge but plenty of confidence. They wore the same style of glasses, used the same buzzwords, nodded at the same moments. It was like watching a corporate boy band audition. Meanwhile, the people who actually built this place, the senior developers who knew our codebase inside and out, the account managers who had relationships spanning years, the operations folks who kept the lights on. They were being systematically marginalized. Not fired, that would be too obvious. Just frozen out of important meetings, excluded from strategic planning, ignored when they raised concerns. It was death by 1,000 cuts, and Bradley was either too blind to see it or too weak to stop it. Funny thing about being underestimated. It's like hiding in plain sight. You stop existing in their reality, which means you can move through it like a ghost. The interns talk openly in front of me because they forget I'm there. I've heard everything from insider gossip to which client account Scott wants to quietly sunset to make the quarterly numbers look prettier. The old shareholders are just noise, he said last Tuesday over lunch, holding a forkful of overpriced quinoa salad. We clean the cap table, rebrand, take it public, and boom, none of this founder baggage matters. Boom, huh? Cute word. Fluffy. Like the look on his face is going to be when he realizes the baggage holds 60% of the company's equity through a trust he's too lazy to trace. See, that's the thing about guys like Scott. They're so busy looking forward, so focused on the future, they never bother to understand the past. They don't read the fine print. Don't dig into the corporate structure. Don't ask questions about how things got to be the way they are. I never sold my shares, never even diluted them. Every funding round, every stock option grant, every equity adjustment, I structured it to maintain my control. Not obviously, not in a way that would show up on the cap table summary that Bradley looks at in board meetings, but buried deep in the legal documents, protected by shell companies and blind trusts that would take a forensic accountant weeks to untangle. I let them believe I stepped back because I was tired, because my health couldn't handle the stress anymore. But what I got tired of was watching egos wreck the thing I'd spent 22 years building while grinning like they'd invented sliced bread. I'm done watching. They've been playing checkers on my chessboard and I just moved my queen. The real kicker? Bradley, my former protege, my hand-picked successor, the guy who once sent me a bottle of bourbon every Founders Day, has started avoiding eye contact in the hallway. His handshakes have gotten softer. He's sweating through meetings that used to be routine. He knows, on some primal level. I think he knows the floor is about to fall out. But Scott's still strutting, still printing color-coded org charts like they're sacred scrolls, still patting Bradley on the back like a frat bro at homecoming. He doesn't see it coming. Doesn't know that I've already called my lawyer, that I've already begun updating the board, that I'm no longer just watching. I'm counting down. 3 moves left, 2 meetings, 1 summit. Then the silence ends, and I speak. Scott's first official team meeting was like watching a car crash choreographed by a theater major with a marketing degree. He rolled into the conference room in a slim-fit suit that looked vacuum-sealed onto his body, holding a designer notebook no one ever saw him write in. Everything about him screamed, "I'm important." The way he adjusted his cufflinks, the way he positioned his phone face down on the table like he was too busy for interruptions, the way he waited for everyone to settle before speaking. "Let's disrupt the status quo," he said, clapping his hands like we were at a TED Talk instead of a quarterly performance review. I'd been to maybe 200 of these meetings over the years. I knew what real strategic planning looked like. This wasn't it. He pulled up a slide titled, "Refactoring the Core Team," as if he'd spent more than 9 minutes learning our org chart. The slide was a mess of boxes and arrows that made no organizational sense. He had our lead developer reporting to marketing, our biggest client manager moved to legacy account maintenance, and 3 department heads lumped under something called operational support. He pointed at names, boxes, arrows, moved entire departments around like monopoly properties. No context, no history, no understanding of why people were in the positions they held or what they actually did. Just colors and acronyms and corporate speak that sounded impressive if you didn't know what any of it meant. The funny part was watching the faces around the room. These were smart people I'd hired and trained and worked with for years. They knew this was garbage, but nobody wanted to be the first to say so. Corporate survival instinct. Keep your head down, don't rock the boat, maybe the consultants will move on to someone else's department. Scott clicked through slide after slide of organizational restructuring, budget reallocation, and efficiency optimization. Every slide looked like it had been generated by the same AI tool, the same fonts, the same color scheme, the same meaningless business graphics. Then he turned toward me, standing right next to the whiteboard with that frat boy smirk, and said it. And of course, Brian, our longtime founder, will continue helping with strategic oversight and legacy coordination. Legacy coordination. Let that sink in for a moment. I went from CEO and majority shareholder to legacy coordination in one PowerPoint slide. The room went still for half a breath, just long enough for every executive present to register the insult and decide whether to react. I could feel them glancing my way, waiting to see how I'd take it. Would the old founder throw a fit? Would there be drama? Would someone finally stand up to the consultant? Bradley glanced my way, brief, mechanical, but said nothing. Not a word. Just stared at the floor tiles like they were suddenly fascinating. The man I'd mentored for 8 years, the guy I'd personally saved from getting fired twice in his first year, couldn't even make eye contact. That's when I knew for certain that this wasn't just Scott's play. Bradley was in on it. Maybe he wasn't the mastermind, but he was definitely a willing accomplice. Scott was already moving on, talking about ROI synergies and lean reinvention, probably inventing phrases as he went. He had charts showing projected cost savings from streamlined leadership structures and graphs demonstrating improved organizational velocity. None of it meant anything, but it looked professional enough to fool a board that didn't ask too many questions. I didn't speak. I didn't blink. I simply wrote one word on my notepad: witnessed. Because that's what this was. A public execution disguised as a business presentation. Scott wasn't just reorganizing the company, he was erasing me from it, and Bradley was helping him do it. Humiliation's a strange thing. It doesn't always arrive with yelling or tears. Sometimes it shows up like static in your spine, a faint buzz just under the skin. You feel it in your jaw, locked tight so the scream doesn't slip out. You feel it behind your eyes where you refuse to let the moisture win. But I've learned over time, rage is a tool, and tools don't work when you're swinging them blind. So I smiled. I nodded. I even jotted something down like a good little founder emeritus. Then I went back to my office, closed the door, turned the blinds, and called Aaron Thompson, my lawyer of 12 years. Aaron wasn't just any lawyer. He was the guy who'd helped me structure the original equity agreements, who'd designed the shell companies that held my shares, who'd written the founder protection clauses that everyone had forgotten about. If anyone could help me navigate this corporate coup, it was him. "Brian," he answered on the first ring. "Please tell me you're calling about a vacation or a new boat, not what I think you're calling about." "Activate the contingency binder," I said. There was a pause. Aaron knew exactly what I was talking about. 6 years ago, when we were bringing Bradley on as CEO and I was stepping back from day-to-day operations, Aaron had insisted on what he called nuclear options, legal mechanisms that would protect my interests if things ever went sideways. I'd thought he was being paranoid. Now I was grateful for his paranoia. "Which scenario are we looking at?" he asked. "Hostile takeover, incompetent management, or betrayal of fiduciary duty?" "All three," I said, with a side of public humiliation and age discrimination. "Jesus," Aaron muttered. I could hear him typing, pulling up files. "You want me to draft the full resolution?" "Yes." The board won. "And dig up the founder clause." A pause, then a soft whistle. "It's go time?" I looked out the window, watching Scott walk across the parking lot with his sunglasses on at dusk, checking his phone like he was running the world instead of running a company into the ground. "It's almost time," I said. "But we're going to let the fish get comfortable in the tank first." The founder clause was buried in a 6-year-old board document, a clause Bradley had forgotten all about because I'd made sure he would, back then. When you're bringing on a new CEO, especially someone younger and more ambitious, you want them to feel trusted and empowered. You don't spend a lot of time talking about the legal mechanisms that let you override their decisions. Back then, Bradley was still humble, still hungry, still grateful for the opportunity. He signed anything I put in front of him, eyes full of trust and ambition. One of those things, hidden in subsection C of the governance restructuring agreement, gave me the right to override executive leadership in a crisis, provided I had backing from 2 legacy investors. I already had 3 in my phone favorites. Scott was the match. Bradley had been dousing the floor in gasoline for the past 2 years with his hiring decisions, his strategic pivots, his willingness to let consultants remake the company in their image. And now I was holding the lighter. But first I needed to know exactly how deep the rot went. Over the next week, I played the role perfectly. I brought coffee to 2 meetings, not because Scott asked, but because I wanted to see who was talking to whom. I emailed calendar invites like a good little administrator. I even complimented Scott's strategic alignment memo to his face, which he'd clearly had AI write because it included the phrase fungible innovation stack 3 times in 2 pages. But while I played secretary, I was also playing spy. The thing about being dismissed as irrelevant is that people forget you have access to things. My keycard still worked everywhere. My login credentials were still active on all the systems. I was still technically chairman emeritus, which meant I had board-level access to documents and communications. I started small. I pulled access logs from our cloud systems, checking who was downloading what and when. I reviewed Slack threads, not just the public channels, but the private groups that people thought were secure. I cross-referenced vendor contracts, looking for any irregularities or unauthorized changes. And I found them. 2 contracts had been rerouted through shell agencies linked to Scott's college roommate, a guy named Trevor who sold culture transformation retreats at some overpriced resort in the Berkshires. The contracts weren't huge, maybe $80,000 combined, but they represented a clear conflict of interest. Scott was steering business to his friend without disclosing the relationship. More interesting was a consulting agreement that Scott had signed with a company called Velocity Partners. According to the paperwork, they were providing strategic advisory services for $15,000 a month. But when I dug deeper, Velocity Partners turned out to be a one-man operation run by Scott's former McKinsey colleague. It was a classic consulting scam. Hire your friends to do work that doesn't really exist, pad the company's expenses, create a paper trail that justifies your own inflated fees. I'd seen it before at other companies, but I never thought it would happen at mine. I printed it all, highlighted the relevant sections, and filed it in a folder I labeled QIS, Quiet Internal Sabotage. Aaron would want to see this when the time came. By Thursday, Scott had begun referring to me as Mr. Bryan in meetings, like I was some elderly uncle who'd wandered in from the nursing home. The condescension was so thick you could cut it with a knife, but nobody said anything. Bradley just sat there, nodding along like Scott was sharing profound wisdom instead of age discrimination gold. The worst part wasn't the disrespect. I'd dealt with that before. The worst part was watching what it was doing to the company culture. The junior employees, the ones who'd never worked anywhere else, were starting to treat me the same way. They'd stop talking when I entered a room, not out of respect but out of embarrassment. They pitied me. That night, I poured a glass of bourbon. The good stuff, not the cheap whiskey I used to drink when I was building the company on credit cards, and opened my laptop. I began composing a letter to the 3 original investors, the people who'd believed in the company when it was nothing but a PowerPoint presentation and a dream. Danny Pierce had been first. He'd written me a check for $50,000 when the company was just me and a broken air conditioner in a strip mall. He was old school, retired military, the kind of guy who believed in handshake deals and looking people in the eye. He'd made his fortune in real estate, but he understood technology enough to see the potential. Jennifer Walsh was the opposite, a supply chain software genius who'd sold her own company to Amazon for $200 million and was looking for the next big thing. She was methodical, analytical, never made a decision without seeing the numbers. But once she was convinced, she was all in. Eddie Sullivan was the wild card. He'd made his money in oil, lost most of it in the 2008 crash, then made it back in tech investments. He had a gambler's instincts and an accountant's attention to detail. He'd invested not because he understood our technology, but because he understood me. The subject line of my email was simple: a situation you should be aware of. The attachment was 47 pages long, financial analysis, organizational charts, evidence of the consulting fraud, projections showing what Scott's restructuring would actually cost the company. The last slide said, proposed leadership realignment. I didn't need to warn Scott he was about to be exposed. He wouldn't see it coming, even if I spelled it out in Comic Sans and stapled it to his forehead. Guys like Scott never see it coming because they're so convinced of their own brilliance that they can't imagine anyone else playing the same game at a higher level. But I wasn't ready to pull the trigger yet. I needed one more piece of the puzzle. The piece came to me courtesy of Michelle Stevens, my former intern who'd grown into one of the sharpest executive assistants I'd ever worked with. Michelle had a talent for being invisible when she needed to be and incredibly observant when it mattered. She slipped me a note during lunch, just a folded piece of paper that looked like a grocery list. On it was written, Conference Room B, 2 p.m., locked door. so I made sure I was walking by conference room B at exactly 2 p.m., heading to the men's room with a stack of papers that made me look busy and official. The door was indeed locked, but the glass walls weren't soundproof. Inside, Scott was presenting to Bradley and 3 of our mid-level VPS, people with just enough stock options to feel important, but not enough institutional knowledge to ask the right questions. Scott had brought printed materials, thick, glossy packets with charts and graphs that looked impressive from a distance. I couldn't hear everything, but I caught enough key phrases: legacy stakeholder optimization, cap table cleanup, founder transition planning. This wasn't just about reorganizing departments or cutting costs. This was about erasing me entirely. I kept walking, casual as could be, but my mind was racing. Scott wasn't just planning to marginalize me. He was planning to buy me out, probably at a fraction of what my shares were actually worth, using some combination of legal pressure and board politics to make it happen. That evening, I waited until the building was empty, then used my keycard to let myself back in. Michelle had accidentally left a copy of Scott's presentation packet on the reception desk, weighted down with a coffee mug so it wouldn't blow away. I took it home and read every word. The title was Operational Realignment, Efficiency Roadmap V 1.4. Even the title was insulting. Like the company's 22-year history was just inefficiency that needed to be corrected. Scott had outlined a 4-phase plan that was surgical in its precision. Phase 1. Reorganize reporting structures to minimize legacy influence. Phase 2. Implement new governance policies that would dilute founder authority. Phase 3. Initiate buyout negotiations with dormant shareholders. Phase 4. Rebrand the company with future-facing leadership and prepare for IPO. It wasn't just a business plan, it was a coup, a perfectly legal, beautifully documented corporate coup designed to remove me from the company I'd built and hand control to people who'd shown up 6 weeks ago. Buried on page 9 was the mechanism. Using something called investor fatigue and reputation management concerns, Scott planned to approach our smaller shareholders, people who'd invested $10,000 or $25,000 years ago and hadn't stayed involved in company operations. He'd offer to buy them out at a modest premium, nothing dramatic, just enough to make it seem like a good deal. Once he controlled enough of those smaller stakes, he could claim majority influence and push through a new stock class that would effectively neuter my 60% ownership. The beauty of it was that it would all look legitimate, even generous. Founder Brian Wallace will be transitioning to an advisory role to focus on his health and family. Except I didn't have any family to speak of, and my health was fine. I sat in my living room until 3 a.m., bourbon glass empty, reading and rereading the document. It was actually brilliant, in a sociopathic kind of way. If I hadn't known it was happening, if I'd trusted Bradley to protect my interests, if I'd actually stepped away like they assumed I had, it would have worked perfectly. But I had known. And I hadn't trusted anyone. And I definitely hadn't stepped away. I texted Aaron. Package confirmed. Timeline accelerated. Board meeting in 2 weeks. His response was immediate. Emergency protocols? I looked at the document one more time, at the org chart that showed my name in a small gray box labeled Advisor, Strategic Transition, and typed back, Big folder. All of it. The big folder wasn't a metaphor. It was a real leather-bound binder, thick as a law school textbook, sitting in Aaron's fireproof safe for 6 years. Inside were the original shareholder agreements, the founder protection clauses, forensic accounting reports, and something Aaron called nuclear documentation. Evidence so damning it could destroy careers. We'd never planned to use it. It was insurance, the kind of protection you hope you'll never need but pay for anyway. Now I was about to collect on that policy. The investor summit was scheduled for the following Thursday. Originally designed as a routine quarterly update, champagne, PowerPoint slides, and handshakes, it had been transformed by Scott into his coronation ceremony. He'd invited not just our regular board members, but potential new investors, strategic partners, and what he called thought leaders in the industry. According to the agenda I'd seen, Scott had reserved 45 minutes for his vision presentation, followed by Bradley's leadership transition overview. I wasn't on the schedule at all. That was about to change. The ballroom at the Westin smelled like money and desperation. Crystal wine glasses gleamed under chandeliers that cost more than most people's cars. Every chair was upholstered in leather, every napkin folded into some impossible geometric shape that probably required an engineering degree. The walls were lined with banners featuring Scott's favorite buzzwords: innovation, transformation, future-ready leadership. Scott had spared no expense. There were branded gift bags at every seat containing USB drives preloaded with his presentation, bottles of premium hand sanitizer with the company logo, and what appeared to be artisanal energy bars that nobody would ever eat. I arrived early and took a seat in the back row. No nameplate, no folder visible. Just me in my standard polo shirt and khakis, looking like exactly what Scott thought I was. A retired founder who'd wandered in to watch the proceedings. Danny Pierce sat 3 rows ahead, dressed like he always was. Clean but unpretentious, like a man who'd learned not to waste money on clothes that didn't make him better at his job. Jennifer Walsh had claimed a seat near the middle, tablet in hand, stylus ready. She'd built her fortune by taking detailed notes and asking uncomfortable questions. Eddie Sullivan arrived fashionably late with a cup of coffee that definitely wasn't from the approved catering service. One by one they found their seats. One by one they caught my eye just long enough to nod. They'd all received my 47-page briefing. They knew what was coming. Bradley took the stage first, smooth as always in his $3,000 suit and practiced smile. Welcome everyone. We're excited to share our vision for the next chapter of our company's journey, a chapter built on innovation, efficiency, and transformation. He spoke for exactly 8 minutes, hitting all the talking points Scott had coached him on: growth metrics, market opportunities, competitive advantages. Nothing you couldn't read in any quarterly report, but delivered with the kind of polished confidence that made investors reach for their checkbooks. Then he introduced Scott. "Ladies and gentlemen," Bradley said, "I'm proud to introduce Scott Martinez, our strategic advisor and the architect of our organizational evolution." Scott stepped forward like he was accepting an Oscar. Behind him, a massive screen lit up with an image of a mountain peak at sunrise, because apparently corporate success now required nature metaphors. "What you're about to hear," Scott began, "isn't just a strategy. It's a revolution. A complete reimagining of what this company can become when we free ourselves from legacy constraints." I counted the buzzwords as he spoke: disruptive innovation, paradigm shift, ecosystem optimization, stakeholder synergy. He managed to use transformation 7 times in his opening paragraph. For 30 minutes he laid out his vision: streamlined operations, modernized leadership, strategic realignment. It all sounded impressive until you realized he was describing the systematic dismantling of everything that had made the company successful in the first place. Then came the slide I'd been waiting for: legacy stakeholder transition plan. Scott clicked through bullets describing how founding-era shareholders would be transitioned to advisory roles to make room for dynamic, forward-thinking leadership. He used phrases like graceful succession and honoring our history while embracing our future. What he meant was, we're getting rid of Brian Wallace and anyone else who remembers how this company actually works. He was wrapping up his presentation, fielding softball questions from investors who didn't know enough to ask the hard ones, when someone in the front row raised their hand. "This all sounds very impressive," the investor said, "but I'm curious about implementation. Who exactly will be leading these changes?" Scott gestured toward Bradley, then toward himself. "Executive leadership will be handled through collaborative consensus with strategic guidance from our advisory team." He paused, scanning the room with that practiced smile. "We'll also have support from founding stakeholders like Brian Wallace, who will continue helping with legacy coordination from his advisory position." There it was again. Legacy coordination. I stood up. Not quickly, not dramatically. Just slowly, deliberately, like a man who'd finally decided it was time to speak. Every head in the room turned toward me. The chatter died. Someone's fork clinked against their plate. I reached under my chair and pulled out the leather folder. "I'm sorry to interrupt," I said, my voice carrying easily across the silent room. "But there seems to be some confusion about my role in this company." Scott's smile faltered. Bradley went pale. I could see investors leaning forward, sensing that something was about to happen. I walked to the front of the room, my footsteps the only sound in the ballroom. I placed the folder on the podium and looked out at the assembled crowd. "My name is Brian Wallace," I said, "and I own 60% of this company." You could have heard a pin drop in Detroit. I opened the folder and pulled out the first document. This is the original shareholder agreement, signed 22 years ago, establishing my majority ownership stake. I placed it on the podium where everyone could see it. This, I continued, pulling out the second document, is the blind trust agreement, executed 6 years ago, which maintains that ownership through a series of legal entities that Mr. Martinez apparently didn't bother to investigate. Scott tried to interrupt. Now wait a minute, this, I said louder, pulling out the third document, is the Founder Protection Clause, signed by Mr. Cooper in 2018, giving me the authority to remove executive leadership in case of breach of fiduciary duty. Bradley's mouth was moving, but no sound was coming out. And this, I said, pulling out the final document, is a board resolution signed this morning by our 3 original investors, authorizing the immediate termination of Scott Martinez's consulting contract and the removal of Bradley Cooper as CEO. I looked directly at Scott. Your presentation is over. For exactly 15 seconds, nobody moved. Then Danny Pierce started clapping. Jennifer Walsh joined in. Eddie Sullivan stood up, still clapping. Within moments, half the room was on their feet. Scott grabbed his materials and left without another word. Bradley sat frozen in his chair until security I'd arranged, escorted him out. I looked out at the investors, the partners, the employees who'd been watching their company get carved up by consultants and cowards. Ladies and gentlemen, I said, let me tell you what this company is actually going to do. And for the next hour, I did exactly that. 3 months later, Scott Martinez was working at a mid-tier consulting firm in Phoenix, his reputation in tech circles permanently tarnished. Bradley Cooper took a job with a startup that folded 6 months later. The consulting contracts with Trevor and Velocity Partners were terminated, saving the company $180,000 annually. As for me, I went back to my office, not the corner table, but the actual CEO office, and got back to work. This time, nobody was confused about who was running the show. The company's revenue increased 23% that quarter. Turns out experience still matters in business. Who knew? In corporate America, they'll call you a dinosaur right up until the moment you remind them who owns the fossil fuel.